Anne Ray?
Yes.
Well, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, I didn't dream that I'd get so far as to be on Blogging Heads TV.
Absolutely. I thought maybe the Ed Sullivan Show, but never Blogging Heads TV.
Yeah, well, here we are. Here we are. I thought we might get started by talking about what our books have in common. Maybe we should hold up our books. I have mine here, and actually I have yours too, so I'm going to hold them up.
Oh, you're going to have to hold both of them.
I'm going to hold them both up.
Okay.
Okay. Freedom's Power and the Idea That Is America.
It would have been simpler if I just said the idea that is America is the idea of freedom's power.
Well, I think there's a lot of overlap. I think both of us are trying to ground our politics in a foundation of principles, of values, and that the books reflect a common impulse to look back toward a tradition. And to recapture that tradition, to refashion that tradition. We approach it a bit differently, we conceptualize it a bit differently, but I think there is that same underlying impulse.
I agree, and when I read your book, it really was with the shock of recognition and with this powerful sense of here is the philosophical and theoretical infrastructure and history for the idea of a nation that could actually be founded on a set of universal values. And those are the stories that my book tells in a folksier way and a way calculated to touch base with a lot of our greatest political figures and really folk figures as well. But I really did have this sense that when I was reading your book, that there was a kind of intellectual carapace around precisely the tradition I was trying to reach back to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope we can strike a chord with an audience even wider than the audience of Blogging Heads TV. But the political season has moved ahead so fast; it seems so front-loaded. The primaries, have all been front-loaded, and the whole campaign moved so far ahead that it seems there's almost no time to talk about general principles and ideas. We're already in the horse race. And I had thought, perhaps you had thought, that coming out with a book in 2007 would at least be in advance of the horse race.
Yes. But it does not, you're right, and instead, actually, I realized that we're in the season of campaign biographies already, right? Where the two Hillary books out, and of course Obama had his book out earlier, which wasn't so much a biography. John McCain's book is coming out next week. And you do wonder where is the space for the debate about the deeper values. Although, from my perspective, and in part given the reaction to my book, there is a deep debate, although it hasn't surfaced as such in the media, over what I would call the values thing. Remember George H.W. Bush, it was all about the vision thing. I think there's actually a debate going on about the values thing in which, oddly, voices on the left and voices on the moderate right are effectively rejecting a value-based foreign policy and really using values as the lodestone of any policy. They're arguing for consequences, pragmatism, against ideology, leaving people like you and me, and oddly the neocons on the other side of the spectrum, with whom I sharply disagree on lots of things, but arguing, wait a minute, values really do have a critical role to play. And part of that, I think, is people see where values, as practiced by the neocons, have gotten us and say, forget it, let's turn our back on the whole enterprise.
Well, I think both of us want to bring back values and principles into the debate, partly because, not just in foreign policy, but in almost every area of politics, there has become such an intense concentration on the fight, on the battle, and the weapons needed to win the battle, whether those are words or whether those are hardball strategies of various kinds. And there is a need at some point to step back from that, even though I take it that the conflict is deadly serious, but we need to step back from it and see what it is we're all about.
Right. Well, it's also complicated, I think, by being in the midst of a political situation in which, on certain issues, I think there is a need for intense struggle. And whether it's partisan struggle or whether it is simply Americans across the political spectrum who want to stand up and say, look, there are things happening in our name that are fundamentally wrong. They are unconstitutional, they are against human values, however you define them, and we must stand up against them. And a tremendous amount of sentiment in the blogosphere and in mainstream media and in the polls reflects a sense that the Constitution itself is under threat. When you look at what's happening with the Attorney General, what's happened with the Vice President. And so that in the midst of that, a call for, well, wait a minute, let's also look to what we're about positively. Let's talk about the role of values, very quickly gets misunderstood for saying, well, let's forget, any objections, let's move on. Let's move on to what we're for rather than what we're against. It's tricky. I think we actually have to be both. I mean, we have to be strongly against an assault on our values and at the same time trying to delineate a more positive program.
Yeah, and I guess I have another line of argument in my book about why we need to think carefully about our constitutional foundations. And it's not simply because we honor the Constitution, we value it, we regard its precedents as so important, but because that constitutional framework has been a basis of our power as well as our freedom. And those two things are really closely connected. And so there really is an alternative strategy for building American prosperity and American power in the world that is consistent with that constitutional tradition, that doesn't try to shed it, that doesn't try to unload all of those constitutional constraints that we have traditionally had, and that's part of the argument that I'm making here in Freedom's Power, that limited power can be more powerful than unlimited power.
And that is the core insight of liberalism as you present it, and in all the ways liberalism has been misunderstood and used pejoratively. Your book goes back to the real tradition, the Enlightenment tradition. But I wanted to ask you in that context, how do you see the assault on that idea? I mean, when you go back to our history, this notion that our liberty is to be found in self-restraint, it is to be found in embracing the rule of law, that is the source of our power, it is the source of our individual citizens' power in the sense of liberty, but it's also the power of our government. And somehow that gave way to this notion that in the foreign policy world took the form of a debate between sovereigntists and globalists, that any restraint was somehow a mark of weakness, was somehow a mark of kind of not just weakness, but wimpiness. And how did we get there?
It's easy to forget that constraints can be enabling, that constraints force us to think twice. Constraints force us to think twice through the checks and balances we have internally that prevent, for example, the executive from acting alone without consulting the Congress, without the check of the judiciary, and that the same kinds of devices internationally can also help us to think twice and avoid catastrophic blunders. And I think part of the reason that we got into Iraq was the fact that we had a failure of all of those breaks in the system, all of the checks and balances. including the break that a Congress might have had if it had been more diligent, that the press might have exerted if it had been more zealous, and all of those things failed. And so the full consequences, the dangers of getting to Iraq, I think, weren't fully anticipated, and now we see them.
Well, and in part, of course, that's the classic fear response, which, as many authors have pointed out, whether it's World War I or World War II or after 9/11, a sense of suspending normal skepticism, suspending normal processes of opposition in the name of patriotism.
Yes.
And one of the themes that I try to argue is that the soul of patriotism is sharp criticism when necessary, and that our greatest patriots have been willing to hold our government to account. But it is not unusual in our history or in the history of any nation to suspend that for a time. But going back to this idea that constraint is the source of power, that's exactly, of course, what Madison and Jefferson were doing. They were constructing a system of constraints that would empower us, as you lay out. And in a folksier way, I quote the second verse of America the Beautiful, which ends, America, America, God mend thine every flaw, confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. So it's even written into the national anthem, or one of our anthems. And yet we've moved far away from it.
Well, I think it's partly the historical sequence here, the sense of omnipotence after the fall of the Soviet Union, that we were the world's only superpower, that nothing really stood in our way. We just had to have the resolve to exploit that power. And then follow that with 9/11, and so you get this sense of omnipotence followed by a sense of fear, and it was, I think, a kind of mixture that was guaranteed to get us in trouble. It was guaranteed to, it's the hubris, and then the panic. It's just a deadly combination.
Yeah.
So, I thought we could also talk about the idea of American exceptionalism.
Yes.
And you've been given a hard time over this, and there's I think, perhaps something of a difference of understanding of that concept. And from my perspective, that's a term that was actually introduced into discussion by sociologists, by Seymour Martin Lipset and Daniel Bell, back in the 1940s and 50s. It comes out of a discussion among socialists. They had been socialists back in the 30s and 40s about why America was different, in particular why there was no socialism in America. And so the idea has transmuted, at least in the social sciences, into being the problem of, it's the problem of American exceptionalism, how to explain why the United States has departed from the patterns followed in the other advanced industrializing societies, in Europe primarily. It's an idea that doesn't necessarily imply that America is superior, is exceptional, is morally superior. And to me, that's not a problematic idea. That is, there is a problem in explaining why America is different. One political scientist has defined American exceptionalism as the proposition that the United States was created differently, developed differently, and therefore has to be understood differently from other countries. Now, at the other extreme, there's the idea that American exceptionalism means that the United States is superior. And that leads to what John Ruggie has called American exemptionalism.
Right.
That the United States should be exempt from the rules that other countries follow. And that clearly is a very different concept, and I can see why you would want to not to identify yourself with that concept. But the first one of the United States, there has been something different about the United States. It does have to be understood differently. Something about America's founding traditions is related to that. I think that's a reasonable proposition.
Well, so in one sense, we completely agree. If you want to say, look, America has pursued a different path than many other, or even all other advanced industrial democracies. The question of why haven't we ever had socialism, a social welfare state, social democracy, that of course is a social scientific question I would quite agree with. But I think there's an intermediate view of American exceptionalism that I would argue against every bit as much as you and I would both argue against exemptionalism. And that is not, it's not the view that America should be exempt, so much as the view that America has an exceptional destiny. America, alone among nations, has the destiny of being the shining city on a hill, the exemplar of liberal democracy. And that's what I was taking on, because to me, when you go back to our founders, what is clear is they thought we were exceptionally blessed. I mean, they thought we were exceptionally fortunate, that we had this great destiny, and our destiny was to be the first nation to prove that a government could be organized along the lines of freedom's power. In other words, if you take your account of liberalism, that what the central idea is that you can actually use self-constraints to create power and a government that would work. In other words, a empowered government. That our founders thought we were the lucky nation that got to demonstrate that to the world. And that's very clear from what the founders wrote. It's even more clear from what people like Webster, who on the laying of the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument, he says, look, we've proved to the world, Daniel Webster, that we can, that it can be done, that you can have a nation, a government based on consent of the governed. But that didn't mean then we were going to be the only nation, or even that we were going to be the unique nation. The hope was that other nations would follow suit. Other nations have followed suit. And what I feel strongly about today is that instead of constantly talking about liberalism and all the associated values as American values, America has to recognize that these are universal values. We were founded on the proposition they were universal values, and we should now embrace all the other trajectories that nations founded on those values have taken. So that we should look at the British experience, of the Japanese experience, of the South African experience, the Indian experience, and learn from them and stop acting as if we are exceptional in the sense that everybody has to look to us.
Right. I mean, I think you might call the kind of exceptionalism that you're arguing against the missionary conception of American exceptionalism, and there is a dangerous arrogance to that conception, which you're exactly right to argue against.
But then I think we come down to the crux of what is so hard about insisting that our policies, again, domestic and international, be based on our values, because very quickly that starts to slide into a missionary conception, that these are our values and we not only are going to live up to them, but we are going to spread them. And on the one hand, I want to say, yes, our policies should be based on those values and we should stand for those values. But that doesn't mean that we alone have some kind of divine mission to enlighten other nations. And that's a narrow space. And I think a lot of the claim today that we should just throw all of it out and turn back to pragmatism is in part a fear that you can't actually define that space, that immediately you will slide all the way to the neocons or to a much more kind of missionary domestic ideological vision as well.
Yeah. So, and I think part of the reaction on this issue, the debate that you've gotten into about your book, is it's partly determined by the title, the idea that it's America, and the identification of America with one set of ideas as being the true America, and leaving out other ideas which are unfortunately also part of our national tradition, the part that perhaps we don't want to hold up to the rest of the world, that involve racism and exclusion and so forth, but they are there. They are part of our history, slavery, our immigration laws for so long, so much else about this country. So it's difficult, I think, to strike the right balance here. I mean, I too want to hold up part of the American tradition as a liberal tradition, as an ideal that we ought to be striving for. But, and I think you agree with this, without denying the historical realities, which is that wasn't the only part of our tradition, and we're still struggling over which part of our tradition is going to be the dominant.
Well, no, I absolutely agree, but you get it at a, the way you phrase it is different than the way I see it. So you see it as different strands in our tradition. There's sort of the good strand, and then there's the other strands, the racism and the xenophobia and the tremendous social injustice, which we are seeing again today. And I see that much more in the way Lincoln put it, where he said, look, the founders set up a set of maxims, and they knew that we weren't going to attain those maxims perfectly. Indeed, they were impossible to obtain perfectly. But the engine that drives change in this country is the striving to achieve them and the ability to sharply criticize our government when it fails so manifestly that you can't even pretend that these are our values. So it seems to me the negative parts of our tradition, or I don't see as different parts, I see that as our failure, repeated failure to actually live up to our ideals. But I see the way we were constructed as allowing, whether it be former slaves or women or gays or any disenfranchised minority or majority, to say to essentially insist that the gap between our rhetoric and reality be closed. So, and to me, that is a vision that we ought to present to ourselves and to the world that is absolutely honest about all the places we have fallen short historically and today, but says, look, the genius, and this goes back, I think, to your idea of liberalism, the genius of the system is that it's constructed in a way that when those faults are brought to light, and they're more than faults, when those evils are brought to light, they can then mobilize change.
Well, I guess, I want to appeal to that same set of ideals, that same tradition, and I want it to be the dominant force in our future as in our past. But I think there's been just a continuing struggle between different elements in our society, going back to the historic struggles over slavery. They've taken new forms. There's just a continuing struggle over the definition of what is America really about, what really are our governing values. So I know, it seems to me you want to see those as failures, as imperfections, but in my view, they're just two different versions of America.
Well, that it's actually very helpful for me to hear that, because it illuminates something for me that I have not understood in so many of the negative reactions to my book, but that is actually helpful. And it also goes to partisanship, which we also wanted to talk about, yes. Which is that I effectively, as both an Enlightenment person and an optimist, effectively see the majority of people, not all, I'm not naive, I couldn't be a dean otherwise, but the majority of people as actually trying to serve the same values, but by different lights. So in other words, when I taught at Chicago, where obviously my colleagues were deeply conservative, many of them, they had the same values. I mean, they believed in liberty and democracy and equality and justice, but their views of how you got there, of how you realized those values, were, in good faith, quite different than mine. and they were born of their life experiences, their religious beliefs, their political affiliations, but they genuinely believe that by smaller government, by no affirmative action, by a much more intrusion of a particular kind of religion in state, that you would get to those values. So what I see is a whole mass of people with often horrific prejudices and biases, but they subscribe to the same values, and the motor of change in this society has been to say to them, you cannot say that you believe in equality and practice this kind of racism. Now, I grew up in the American South, and of course, there's some people who are just goners, but over time, that process was able to bring about the social change we have actually seen. And so that I don't see them as different traditions. I see an entire nation, again, with substantial numbers of people, but minorities who are probably simply have got to be squelched or denied, but a majority of people actually able to respond to the call to live up to these values.
Well, I do think there is a tradition that extends into the past, a constitutional tradition that is shared by conservatives and liberals, and I call it constitutional liberalism in the book. Conservatives might want to give it a different name, but yes, there's a lot of overlap there. But in recent decades, the two sides have moved further apart in this country. We have become polarized over very fundamental judicial questions, political questions. It's simply undeniable. It can be quantified, in fact, in terms of voting patterns in Congress. And I think it's not been a matter of the two sides moving equally apart from each other. Paul Pierson and Jacob Hacker, in their book Off-Center, described this as asymmetrical polarization. Asymmetrical because Republicans have become a lot more conservative than Democrats have become more liberal. And again, this can be quantified in voting patterns in Congress and elsewhere. The parties moved apart partly because the South turned, and that made the Democratic Party more liberal, and it made the Republican Party more conservative. But it also, the Republican Party also became more conservative because younger Republicans who got elected to Congress or rose to high office have been more conservative than the ones they replaced. You can see this actually in the generational divisions, the elder George Bush and the younger George Bush, the elder George Romney and the younger Mitt Romney. There has been a clear movement to the right, very sharp movement to the right among Republicans. And you can see it just in the way the candidates, the presidential candidates, are talking this year, in the way they are cultivating that conservative base. And so, for example, Mitt Romney will say he'll double the size of Guantanamo, and they will try to outdo each other in aggressive talk about Iran. So I think there's just the center of gravity in the Republican Party has moved very far to the right, and so it's just harder to see that overlapping common ground that you want to base your politics on. It's difficult to find it.
You're right empirically. There's no question that this is a time of intense polarization. I think I see the beginnings of the pendulum swinging back, but I would not for a minute deny that in the last really 15 years, because it started, of course, in 1994 with Newt Gingrich and has continued, that there has been this polarization. And I also agree empirically what my colleague Nolan McCarty, a political scientist, also shows is that the Republicans have been more responsible for the polarization than the Democrats. That there is blame on both sides, but there's greater blame on the Republican side. I agree. I think quite neutral political scientists have showed that. And of course there were big political shifts. As I said, I grew up in the American South. Everybody was a Democrat when I was growing up, although when I got to college I discovered that a Virginia Democrat was a New York Republican. But by the time I came back from college, people had all become Republican and then increasingly moving to the right. So but I think many Republicans feel that their own party was hijacked by a relatively small minority that was an incredibly ardent base. It's one of the rules of politics, right, that a very motivated minority will have far greater power over a moderately motivated majority. And of course what we've also seen was the decision by the evangelical right to get politically active, which was a sociological change also. So I think there's no question that that's what we've seen. Whether or not that reflects accurately the views of a majority of Americans today, I don't think so. I think that in fact, although you see Republicans pandering to a particular base, you also see Rudy Giuliani getting out there, and he's leading in the Republican polls and saying, wait a minute, I've had enough. You know, I support the right to choose, and I am not going to pretend that I don't. And the Republican Party has to be big enough to have people who support the right to choose and the people who oppose it. So I think actually there you're seeing even on the Republican side the beginning of the turn. And on the Democrat side, it's very striking that Obama is running very strongly on a return to bipartisanship, and Hillary Clinton, in many ways, when she started her campaign, was demonstrating that she could work across the aisle. Similarly, there are many, many Democrats and I think moderate Republicans who are recognizing that the sort of Bush intensive partisanship was very, very destructive, and who are once again becoming more empowered. Although, look, there's a daily battle within the administration between the hardline partisans and the people I would describe as more moderate Republicans. So I don't deny where we've been, but I think that's more of an aberration. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to say, hold on a minute. In the first place, you can be as patriotic as anyone and have a very different vision of how our ideals ought to be achieved, and you can, I think, rally people from right and left around a more common vision.
I guess I don't think what's happened recently is entirely an aberration. I think we are in a new phase of American political history. I think it is going to be more polarized. There may be variations in the intensity of that polarization. I think right now Democrats have an advantage because Republicans have lost so many independents. And because I think a lot of people who used to be liberal or moderate Republicans find that there really is no place for them anymore in the contemporary Republican Party. So they have gotten themselves, I think, into a bit of a problem. And the logical thing after the primary season is over is that whoever is the Republican nominee would move somewhat toward the center. That would be the rational thing. I'm not saying it's actually going to happen, but I do think we're in a different phase. I think the shift of the South, the conservative revolution within the Republican Party. These are fundamental changes that are going to be with us for a very long time, and I think we are going to be bitterly divided about many fundamental choices in this country, and consequently, I think we have to accept that that is the nature of the world that we face, and that it is a bad thing, it is a mistake to turn the other cheek, to pretend otherwise, and that partisan attacks have to be reciprocated.
Whoa, all right, well, we've moved from great agreement on liberalism and the nature of American values to real disagreement. I mean, so So a couple questions to begin with. How would you explain the phenomenal success of the audacity of hope? I mean, what Obama is running on is a new approach to American politics. How would you explain the success of Schwarzenegger or Bloomberg, where the polls show you could get 20% of people tomorrow who would say, and I think you could get more, who would say neither party represents really where I think I am, that there's a vast moderate center that is simply not represented. I mean, I think if you look at what's happening, and even in the South, the South, I am from Virginia. Virginia was, of course, the most reliable conservative state. It is now it was governed by a Democratic governor who managed to raise taxes with a Republican legislature with Mark Warner. It has another Democratic governor, and Jim Webb beat George Allen. Virginia's a bellwether state, and what that's telling you is there's a lot more support for moderate people who can actually get things done.
What that's telling you is that there's a growth of the Washington suburbs and a lot more Democratic votes in Virginia.
Not so. That is true, but that you can't get elected just on Northern Virginia. You simply can't.
Well, that's why Jim Webb is not a Northern liberal in the conventional way, and I agree with you.
So my definition of moderate may be absolutely, the people who are willing to make more compromise with the other side. But the idea is, again, that, again, I'm looking at Obama and I'm looking what he's saying. I'm actually looking at what Hillary's saying and what she's running on. These are the front runners, and they are not running on sharp partisan
No, of course not. And because a Democrat couldn't win that way without attracting the independent voters, and there is a longing that you express, and I think that many voters feel, for a less partisan politics. But that doesn't really mean it's going to happen. And by the way, as far as Schwarzenegger and Bloomberg are concerned, their politics makes sense for a Republican in a very democratic state or city.
But for instance, what we know is that Schwarzenegger, who is a popular and effective governor in many ways, certainly not perfect, could never have been elected, given the primary system, if he'd come up the normal way. But that he can win the general election, right? Because that's where the majority of voters will support him. But in our primary system, we systematically select for the more extreme, the more partisan sides, so that we end up getting people both in Congress and in governor's offices who actually are more partisan than the majority of American voters. I'm not denying the problems with the political system that give us more partisan politics. What I'm denying is that actually reflects the views of a substantial majority of American voters, and I'd say in the South as well.
Yeah, I guess I don't mind the politics where views are sharply delineated, where the differences are set forth, even where there's a pretty tough hardball aspect to it. I think that's the way democratic politics often are. It's just a fact of life, and it's nice. Look, within a university that doesn't make sense, but in the larger political arena, to me that is simply something you have to accept. And again, you go back through American history to the early republic. There were bitter divisions. That's something we've learned to. I even think it's often a very productive thing. So,
well, we agree on that. I mean, this is one thing I guess I've had a really hard time understanding, because I've never thought anybody would not accuse me of being vehement on the attack on something I just was upset about, on torture, on constitutional violations, on where we are in the world. I come second to none in absolute outrage as to what has happened in this country. And there is no room for compromise. There is no room for, well, gee, let's make nice. This is profoundly wrong. And we should stand up. I proposed that we march on Washington, and got laughed out of the blogosphere for such an impractical political suggestion when I was writing for TPM Cafe. That, to me, is not partisanship. That is standing for what you believe in. That is justified political criticism, and the sharper the better. And the sharper the debate, the sharper the delineation of positions. That's not only our political system, that's the adversary system and our legal system. That's what we believe, that the sharper the fight, the more likely some kind of truth will emerge. That, to me, is not what I mean when I condemn partisanship. That's just politics. That's fine. That's what it's about. What I'm talking about is demonization of anyone who disagrees with you. The claim that somebody, and the amount of personal hate mail that I get, it just simply confirms it. And in the blogosphere, that if you disagree, you are evil. You're not even worth talking to, because you clearly are not somebody who, of good faith, tries to achieve something by different lights. You're somebody who must really believe something truly wrong. And that's exactly what I think what the hard right brought to Washington. And instead of giving it back, I think the Democrats have to return to a political discourse that can actually say, for instance, on abortion, well, nobody wants abortion. I subscribe to the safe, legal, and rare. We understand how you can feel as passionately as you feel about a right to life.
Yes.
That's not how we feel. Here's where, here's the better public policy. Or similarly to say, there's some things the Bush administration is actually doing right on Korea, on Iran, and it's okay to say that, even if you think there are things that they are doing that are so wrong, they're impeachable in some cases, certainly with regard to the vice president. That's what I mean by partisanship.
Okay, so maybe we're not so far apart on that one after all. I guess the piece that you wrote in the Washington Post seemed to me to be shunning partisanship altogether, but maybe you're defining it in a much more narrow way than I would.
Well, I'm going to write a response, but lesson one is do not try to write an argument that has more than a couple of twists and turns in an op-ed piece, because obviously there was no room to talk about again, what I do not see vehement opposition to much of what this administration is doing as partisanship. I see that as indeed a patriotic obligation, because I see violations of our laws, of the Constitution, of our values, and to me that's not about partisanship. To me, as I said, my definition of partisanship is a kind of my party right or wrong, and if you're of the other party, then you're wrong. And that is not going to get us out of Iraq, and frankly, if the next Democratic administration, should there be one, if it takes the sort of anything but Bush view that the Bush administration took of the Clinton administration, the ABC, anything but Clinton, we're going to be in trouble. And a lot of Democrats in the foreign policy world are recognizing, that's what I was trying to write about, that actually we better start working with Republicans whom we can see at least some eye to eye with now on how are we going to project a sufficiently firm policy on Iraq that we don't make matters even worse. In other words, how do we signal that there is going to be some staying the course as long as the course is one we've been in on now, before Bush gets out of office? How do we signal that with respect to other parts of the world? And again, this is probably more a foreign policy argument than a domestic argument, although domestically, the immigration fight was the kind of fight we had to have, and I praise Bush for at least being willing to stand for it.
But really, let's come back to Iraq.
Okay.
Because when it comes time to vote, the votes have pretty much been along party lines, with only a very few exceptions. The administration is holding the vast majority of Republicans in line. So I don't know that there is much opportunity there for a bipartisanship that could get us out of Iraq. I think right now the administration is just going to dump this into the lap of the next president. We are very unlikely to be in anything but the same situation come the end of the Bush presidency.
Well, I don't agree. I actually don't think that a lot of the Republicans in Congress are going to let Bush just dump it in the laps of the next administration because of the danger to our national security. I think that's how I read the key Republican defections this past month in July, essentially saying, hey, look, we're not going to let you go in September and then say in September, well, we're really not sure how the surge is doing, we need another 6 months. That what moderate Republicans are saying, or Republicans, however you want to characterize them, important, influential Republicans like Warner, like Lugar, like Domenici are saying in the Senate is, we don't buy this strategy if it's simply a strategy of drift. You have got to do more than just say, let's kick the can down the road. You have to have a plan and a real strategy for how we are going to get ourselves out in 2008 and 2009. I would say the Democrats have done a great job of forcing that by refusing to cave too early and by insisting that if there is not a strategy that they can in fact get behind, they are going to exercise their power and they're going to continue pushing it as the political issue it is. I think that's politics, and that they've played a very good job. But I actually think, and all the serious foreign policy thinkers that I can think of right now are increasingly saying, look, how we get out is incredibly important. We can't just pull out. We're going to have to get out in a way that continues to safeguard our interests. It's probably going to be 2 or 3 years in which we still have a sizable number of troops, although nothing like the number of troops we have today. The debate, if the E.J. Dionne's column about a month ago, is increasingly between different types of withdrawal plans. The new Center for a New American Security Plan is a 5-year plan. The Center for American Progress Plan is more like a 2-year plan. But the moderate Republicans and Democrats can actually agree on the need to get our troops out, but in a way that safeguards our interests.
That could mean very different things. And I think it's very unlikely this administration is going to accept any plan that contemplates withdrawal within 2 years, that makes any significant drawdown of troops before January of 2009. I don't see any reasons for optimism here. I think
you don't see any reason to.
I don't see any reason to believe that there is going to be a significant change in policy by the end of this administration. I think there may be a cosmetic change. I think there may be some change to pacify public opinion, but I don't think there's really going to be a substantial change. I think the problem will be left in effect to the next president.
I'll take that bet. I mean, I don't think, do I think that this administration is going to announce a major shift in policy? No, that's not the way they do business. But do I think, in fact, by the time a Democrat takes office, a plan will have been put in place, and it may well have been insisted on by a Democratic majority in the Congress, but that a plan will be put in place that a Democrat coming in will be more or less on board with? Yes. I think by January of 2009, we will be in a markedly different situation than we are now, and although a new president will do some things differently, I would predict that president is actually going to be pursuing the rough outlines of a policy that has substantial agreement across the center of the political spectrum. That's a bet.
Yeah.
We can reconvene in January of 2009 and see on that one. And I think that's driven by political necessity and military necessity. I don't think, again, this is not. The one thing I want to make clear is there's no point in bipartisanship for bipartisanship's sake. There's a point in bipartisanship for getting things done that have to get done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you may be right that the Democratic nominee, if it's Senator Clinton, does stay within that consensus. So that may be right.
So, Paul, I am unfortunately being told that our time is up here. We have other things we could talk about, but I would like to close by urging anybody who's watching this to read your book, As I said, when I read it, it was with a shock of recognition and a sense that those of us who have been willing to declare ourselves liberals, even when that has been the most profoundly dirty word, have finally been vindicated.
Oh, and I will urge people to read your book to be reminded of what America should be.
Thanks.
Okay.
Great.
So long.
Bye-bye.